B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, October 30th, 2019. Your humble host is back in the saddle here after 4 nights of total blackout. And this podcast is not brought to you by the rogue bankrupt utility Pacific Gas and Electric. Now, I'll get to my story here in just a moment, but in this limited podcast, I wanted to bring you some important news that crossed my path, even though I was totally blacked out, without access to the internet. Got my newspapers, and I like that, but I've been off the grid, and I will be catching up over the next few days. But one story that did penetrate is the arrest of Max Blumenthal 5 days ago. D.C. cops came to his home. They were ready for a SWAT-style raid. They had a whole team of officers because, you know, Max Blumenthal has a black belt. Oh, maybe not. Anyway, they presented a warrant for his arrest that is at least 5 months old. And they hustled him out into a police van, took him to D.C. Central Jail. He was held for 2 days in various cells and cages, at one point shackled by his hands and ankles for over 5 hours in a cage along with other inmates. His request for a phone call. You see that in the movies. Everybody gets one phone call, right? Nope. Not Max Blumenthal. That was denied. And he was informed that he's been accused of simple assault by a Venezuelan opposition member. This is a 100% false, fabricated, bogus, untrue, and malicious lie, Max Blumenthal declared. It is clearly part of a campaign of political persecution designed to silence me and the Gray Zone Project for our factual journalism exposing the deceptions, corruption, and violence of the far-right Venezuelan opposition. The warrant itself is 5 months old. And according to an individual familiar with the case, the warrant for Blumenthal's arrest was initially rejected. But what he calls a false charge has been revived months later without the defendant's knowledge. And this account, by the way, is from his colleague Ben Norton, and it's available online at thegrayzoneproject.com. Blumenthal went on to say, if the government had at least told me I had a warrant, I could have voluntarily surrendered and appeared at my own arraignment. I have nothing to fear because I'm completely innocent of this bogus charge. Instead, the federal government essentially enlisted the D.C. police to SWAT me, ensuring that I would be subjected to an early morning raid and then languish in prison for days, without even the ability to call an attorney. Now, I find this really shocking. As you know, I have the highest regard for Max Blumenthal and his work as a journalist. He's been courageous, been in Venezuela this year, been in Syria, and he writes without fear or compromise. And that is what our First Amendment widely protects. And what I'm shocked about is that this arrest has not made it into my local San Francisco Chronicle. And it was not in the Sunday New York Times, which was the last time I saw the Gray Lady. Now, if you remember back to April and May, Medea Benjamin and others were occupying the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. to keep it from being held by Juan Guaido and the U.S.-supported coup leaders. The activists formed what they called the Embassy Protection Collective, and the Maduro government gave them authority, permission to stay in the embassy. And hordes of violent right-wing activists who support the Venezuelan opposition launched a de facto 24/7 siege of the embassy, preventing people, food, and supplies from entering the building. So 2 reporters, Anya Parampil and Alex Rubinstein, who both write for the Gray Zone, were embedded inside the embassy, Blumenthal stayed outside and documented the right-wing mobs lashing out with racist and sexist invective, as well as some skirmishes, as the occupation went on for some time. And why the government would essentially process a warrant and then sit on it for 5 months and then decide suddenly that it is something that should be activated? Well, this is bizarre. Blumenthal believes it could be related to the most recent report at the Gray Zone, an article on how the USAID paid the salaries of Guaido's team as they lobbied the U.S. government. Quoting Max, "I am firmly convinced that this case is part of a wider campaign of political persecution, using the legal system to shut down our factual investigative journalism about the coup against Venezuela and the wider policy of economic warfare and regime change waged by the Trump administration." So this is a moment to go to the ramparts. Every reporter in America should be standing up for Max Blumenthal, including the highly paid anchors on major cable news channels. But because Max is not an establishment guy, he's not an inside the beltway, chummy, access journalist, you're going to hear a lot of silence. And I, for one, will stand firm for Max Blumenthal. Through this entire episode, I'll get in touch with him and see if he wants to talk about it. But I want you to challenge the reporters who you respect, the people who you might have some email or other contact with. Because an attack on one is an attack on all. And we've seen the corporate media do its dance with Julian Assange. Ooh, Rachel Maddow says, this is stinky. She can't separate her distaste for the messenger with the fact that she lives and thrives under the same rules. And if they are taken away from Julian Assange or Max Blumenthal, Rachel Maddow will receive the same treatment. So I'll be pursuing this story, but as I'm kind of recovering from almost 5 days without power, without internet, and let me first say that the people north of us in Sonoma County have it the toughest. Almost 100 homes have been lost. Up to 200,000 people have been evacuated from different parts of Sonoma County. The Kincaid fire has burned over 100 square miles, and it is some 30% contained as of today. And so the story I'm going to tell you pales in comparison to the risk, the loss, the threat, the uncertainty that people who are really affected by the fires are experiencing. For myself, here in Marin County, we have not been at risk of a wildfire, but our rogue and bankrupt utility decided, and I'm not going to totally second-guess the decision they made for a power shutoff. We had winds gusting up to 85 miles an hour, and with a hot fire that is likely caused by PG&E equipment, despite the first blackout they put into effect. Well, the Kincaid fire, with these high winds, northeasterlies coming from onshore, we call them Diablos in Northern California, and Santa Anas in Southern California. And I can tell you that I've been applying body lotion to my hands and other parts of my skin because our humidity is so low. It's been in single digits for days now that we've had a very extreme incident here. And I think the utility did make the right call to shut down the power. Now, the way they did it is so chaotic so arbitrary. And they seem to forget when they pulled the plug on the power that all of our toys, devices, communications tools, cell towers are impacted. Now, the cell phone companies have battery backups, they have generators, but we had substantial loss of communications connectivity here. One point on Sunday, I was trying to reach my brother who lives just 5 miles away. I couldn't call him, I couldn't text him, I couldn't email him. I take that back. I out of 11 attempts, 1 text got through. And they were able to text me back once, but that was it. So I ended up just driving over there to talk to him. My cousin was in town, and I wanted to get to visit with Brendan. So I have to say that it is just so weird. Jim Morrison and the Doors had that great song, Strange Days Have Found Us. And since I couldn't put on a music player, access my Spotify account, I was using the digital audio archives in my head and just humming tunes and, thinking of songs. But Strange Days played in my little system many times. And now it feels like kind of coming out of a coma because I wasn't really able to communicate much with people. And so we just hunkered down at home. And Kathy and Chloe and I were there, glamping in our own home with camp lanterns, candles. Oh, yeah, we hit the freezer very hard and have reduced the backlog there. And while we did, see some food spoil, it was because the temperatures outside were not that hot. It didn't have that much impact immediately. So, for example, a gallon of milk I bought on Friday is still okay. It warmed up a little bit, but it didn't spoil. And the other issue is that there was a symphony of generators that started on Sunday and grew louder as more people got generators and hooked them up and turned them on. And I did see my neighbor who had this really loud one. He had his gas can outside, and he also had a fire extinguisher. And that's good. Because my concern is that all the people who decide to buy a generator and plug it in don't know how to connect it to their house properly. And people will be out there in the middle of the night regassing their generator, and it can start another fire right there. We don't have any incidents like that reported so far, but it is a possibility. So we have a lot to learn from this. The cell phone companies must be held responsible. Now, if fire takes out a cell tower, I don't expect that to be a liability to them. But, for example, here in Marin County, all we had was high winds. And that doesn't prevent them from going and putting new batteries in or adding a generator to a tower. And the worst offender happens to be the company that I carry, that I use as my carrier, the telegraph division of AT&T. And at one point, it was barely working. As I mentioned, I couldn't text, email, or make a phone call. And consider what it's like if you're getting an evacuation notice. Or if you think you might have missed one because the battery on your phone's going south or you just didn't have a connection at that moment. And the future of Pacific Gas and Electric is very much in discussion. There are talks of breaking it up. Governor Newsom wants Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway to come in and buy up PG&E. But my favorite outcome here is to make it a public utility. And on Friday, I'm going to be releasing an in-depth interview with a woman who has become an expert on PG&E and a possible public ownership process. So that's coming up here in the next few days at the Peter B. Collins podcast. I just want to send out love, warmth, and light to the people who are still affected by the power outage, by the fire itself, by the evacuations, and particularly those who have lost their homes or businesses. And I'll tell you that Kathy and I have thought about retiring to Sonoma County. But the last 3 years, fire season has been so brutal, so deadly, that many people who've lived there for years are reconsidering it as livable habitat on this planet. And finally today, I want to note that I released a podcast. Actually, the team at Who, What, Why did. I submitted it on Friday, and they published it a couple of days later. And it's available to you today at whowhatwhy.org. It is the discussion about plastic waste and how the industry has created more than half of the plastic waste that is cluttering the planet in the last 13 years. This is a recent phenomenon. And Brett Chamberlain, who's the impact producer for a new film called The Story of Plastic, is very well-versed, quite knowledgeable about these issues, and I think you'll find it a fascinating interview. Here's an excerpt from my Who, What, Why conversation with Brett Chamberlain.
Certainly big plastic, as we refer to them, that is the petrochemical industry, which produces much of the plastic that we see in the world, and of course the fast-moving consumer goods companies, which integrate those plastics into their supply chains and use them to package their products, would really like for us to keep the focus on the end of life. So they'd like for all the attention and, of course, the investment as well to remain on trying to clean the plastic out of the oceans or pick up beaches or do advertising against individual litter bugs. But that really is an effort to shift the focus and shift the blame onto individual consumers rather than admitting that we are seeing so much dramatic plastic pollution entering the environment because there's so much low and no value plastic entering the economy. So the film is in part an effort to look upstream, to draw the attention back from the focus that has dominated media and previous documentaries on plastic on beaches and in the ocean, and look at who's creating all this plastic in the first place and how can we hold them responsible.
You're invited to listen to the full interview with Brett Chamberlain on the new documentary, The Story of Plastic. It's available right now. No subscription needed at whowhatwhy.org. I'm Peter B. Collins. I'm back. You'll find it on YouTube. Thanks for listening.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.